Imagine being arrested by someone who doesn't even realize they work for you. The red and blue lights painted the night in restless flashes, stretching across the cracked pavement and reflecting off the windows of parked cars like silent witnesses to something that was about to go very wrong. Officer Ryan Cole stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, his boots hitting the ground with measured authority, his radio humming faintly at his shoulder. The scene was tense but controlled. At least in his mind, and then there was her, standing just a few feet away, calm in a way that didn't match the chaos around her. Naomi Carter didn't raise her voice, didn't argue, didn't even move much at all. She simply stood there with her hands visible, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, like someone who had already seen how this would end. Ryan glanced at her once, then twice, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place something that didn't quite fit. But instead of pausing, he leaned into his authority. "You need to step back," he said, his tone clipped, dismissive, the kind of voice that expected compliance without question. A few bystanders lingered nearby, phones half raised, curiosity mixing with discomfort as the tension in the air thickened. Naomi didn't step back, not because she was defiant, but because she didn't need to. There was a quiet certainty in the way she held herself, something that didn't belong in a moment like this. Something that didn't match the role Ryan had already assigned to her in his mind. "I said step back," he repeated, louder this time, his voice carrying across the scene, drawing more eyes, more attention, more pressure. But still, she didn't react the way he expected. No fear, no urgency, just a steady gaze that met his, and for a split second, something shifted, something subtle, like the air tightening before a storm. But Ryan pushed past it, because that's what he always did. He reached for control, for dominance, for the version of the situation that made sense to him. "You don't belong here," he added, almost under his breath, but loud enough for the people nearby to hear. A murmur rippled through the small crowd, not loud, not confrontational, just enough to make the moment heavier. Naomi's eyes didn't leave his, and then, almost quietly, almost like a thought spoken out loud, she said, "Are you sure about that?" The question didn't sound like a challenge, it didn't sound emotional, it sounded precise, deliberate, like a line placed exactly where it needed to be. Ryan frowned slightly, the confidence still there, but now with a trace of irritation. He wasn't used to being questioned, not like this, not without resistance, not without noise, and yet somehow, her silence was louder than anything else on that street. The radio at his shoulder crackled faintly, a voice beginning to push through the static. But he hadn't noticed yet, not fully, not in the way that mattered, because in that moment, standing just a few feet away from Naomi Carter, Officer Ryan Cole still believed he was the one in control, and that was the only mistake he needed to make. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, cutting through the noise like a blade that had been waiting for its moment. "Unit 12 confirmed status," the voice said, calm but firm, and for a second Ryan hesitated, just a second, but it was enough for something unseen to begin shifting beneath the surface. Naomi did not move, her eyes still locked on his, steady and patient, as if she had heard this exact tone before, as if she knew what came next. Ryan lifted his shoulder slightly, pressing the radio closer. "Situation under control," he replied, his voice tight, measured, trying to reclaim the rhythm he was used to, but control was already slipping in ways he could not yet see. The air around them felt heavier now, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. A few more people had gathered, their whispers quieter now, more cautious, as if instinctively sensing that something was not what it seemed. Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not in defiance, not in submission, but in quiet acknowledgement of something beyond him, something he was not yet part of. "Are you sure it is?" she asked softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear, and yet it landed harder than anything shouted. Across the scene, Ryan's jaw tightened, irritation rising. He was not used to this kind of resistance, not this calm, not this controlled. It did not fit the pattern he understood, and that made it dangerous, even if he could not explain why. "Do not make this more complicated than it needs to be," he said, stepping half an inch closer, trying to re-establish the space between authority and compliance. But Naomi did not step back, she simply stood there, her breathing even, her posture unchanged. And that was when the radio spoke again, louder now, clearer. Unit 12, we need confirmation on the individual at your location. Repeat, confirm identity immediately. This time the words did not sound routine, they carried weight, urgency wrapped in control. Ryan frowned, glancing briefly at Naomi, then back at the street as if the answer might be written somewhere in the flashing lights or the faces in the crowd. I already told you, it is handled, he said, but there was a slight edge. Now, something less certain, something thinner than before. Naomi exhaled slowly, not a sigh, not frustration, just a measured breath, and then she shifted her gaze slightly, not away from him, but past him, toward the dark SUV that had quietly pulled up across the street minutes earlier, its engine still running, its windows tinted just enough to hide the people inside. Ryan followed her eyes for a brief moment, then dismissed it. Because that is what he had always done, dismiss what did not fit, ignore what he did not understand. Last warning, he said, his voice lower now, controlled, but beneath it there was something else, something beginning to crack. Naomi looked back at him, and this time there was the faintest trace of something new in her expression, not anger, not fear, but certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself, the kind that waits. You might want to listen, she said quietly, and almost on cue, the radio came alive one more time, louder than before. Unmistakable now. Unit 12, stand down and confirm, you are engaging with a federal operative. Repeat, federal clearance has been verified. And in that moment, everything changed, not all at once, not with noise or chaos, but with silence, the kind of silence that forces the truth to settle in whether you are ready for it or not. Ryan's hand froze where it was, his thoughts scrambling to catch up with words he had not expected to hear, and Naomi Carter did not move, because she never needed to. She had been standing in control the entire time, he just had not realized it yet. For a moment, no one moved, not Ryan, not the crowd, not even the air itself. It was as if the entire street had paused to process what had just been said. The words federal operative hung there, heavy and undeniable, and Ryan felt it before he understood it. That subtle shift where control slips through your fingers without warning. His grip loosened just enough to betray the certainty he had carried seconds ago. That is not possible, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, because accepting it meant unraveling everything he had already committed to in front of witnesses, cameras, and his own sense of authority. Naomi watched him carefully, not with triumph, not with anger, but with the calm patience of someone who had seen this reaction before. The moment when confidence turns into calculation, when the mind races to rewrite what just happened. You should listen to your dispatch, she said, her voice steady, almost gentle, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. The radio crackled again, more insistent now. Unit 12, stand down immediately, supervisors are en route, do not escalate. And this time there was no ignoring it, no pushing it aside. The command was clear, direct, and public. A few heads in the crowd turned toward Ryan, their expressions shifting from curiosity to realization. Something bigger was unfolding, something none of them had expected when they stopped to watch. Ryan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, his training telling him one thing, his instincts telling him another, and for the first time that night, those two voices did not align. If this is some kind of mistake, he began, but the sentence did not finish, because deep down he already knew it was not. Naomi reached slowly, deliberately, not in a threatening way, not in a sudden movement, but with the precision of someone who understood exactly how every motion would be perceived, and from inside her jacket she produced a small leather case. She did not snap it open dramatically, she did not raise it high for the crowd, she simply held it at a level where he could see it, where he had to see it, and when it opened, it did not shout, it did not need to. The badge inside spoke with a quiet authority that did not depend on volume. Ryan's eyes locked onto it, scanning, processing, resisting, and then failing to deny what was right in front of him. The edges of his confidence collapsed inward, not violently, not suddenly, but like a structure that had been standing on a flaw all along. The sound of another vehicle approaching grew louder, tires rolling over asphalt with purpose, and the dark SUV across the street finally came alive, its doors opening in sync. Figures stepping out with a kind of calm that did not match urgency but defined it. The crowd instinctively parted just enough to create space. As if recognizing that this moment no longer belonged to them, Naomi closed the case and lowered her hand, her eyes never leaving Ryan, and in that silence, in that narrow space between realization and consequence, she spoke again. "This is where you decide what happens next." Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement of fact, and for the first time since the lights started flashing, Officer Ryan Cole was no longer the one deciding anything at all. The sound of car doors closing echoed softly, controlled, deliberate, not rushed, not chaotic, but final in a way that made everyone watching understand that something irreversible had just begun. The figures from the SUV moved forward with quiet precision, their presence alone shifting the atmosphere from confusion to clarity. No raised voices, no sudden movements, just authority that did not need to announce itself. Ryan felt it immediately, that difference, the kind that cannot be challenged. Because it does not rely on perception, it relies on fact. His posture adjusted without him realizing it, shoulders tightening, stance less certain, as if his body understood before his mind fully caught up. Naomi remained where she was, still and composed, the center of a moment she had never lost control of. One of the approaching agents stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving briefly from Naomi to Ryan, then back again, assessing, confirming. "Agent Carter," he said with a slight nod, his tone respectful but direct, not a question, not a surprise, just acknowledgement. Naomi returned the nod, subtle, almost minimal, but enough to complete the exchange. Ryan watched this silently, the pieces aligning in ways he could not ignore anymore. The title, the authority, the shift in tone, it was all there, undeniable now. The agent turned slightly toward him, not aggressive, not confrontational, but clear. "Officer Cole, we will take it from here." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not allow room for interpretation. For the first time that night, Ryan did not respond immediately, his thoughts catching up, replaying every word he had said, every assumption he had made, every moment he had acted without question, and now each one of those moments felt different, heavier, as if they had been recorded in a language he only just learned to understand. Naomi took a small step forward, not to close distance, not to assert dominance, but to reposition herself within a reality that had finally aligned with the truth. Her voice remained calm, steady. "Everything that happened here was documented," she said, not as an accusation, not as a threat, but as a statement that did not need emphasis. Ryan glanced briefly toward the body camera on his uniform, then toward the phone still held by people in the crowd, and then back at her, the realization settling deeper, the kind that does not hit all at once, but spreads, layer by layer, until there is no space left for denial. The agent beside her spoke again. "There is nothing further required from you at this moment." And even that phrasing, neutral and procedural, carried a finality that Ryan could not push against. The crowd had gone quieter now, not out of fear, but out of understanding. They were no longer watching a confrontation, they were witnessing a correction. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in clarity, as if what mattered now was not what had already happened, but what would come from it. She looked at Ryan for a moment longer and said, "Authority is not about who you think belongs, it is about what you choose to recognize." The words landed without force, but they stayed, lingering in the space between them, and as the agents began to move around the scene with calm efficiency, Ryan Cole stood there, no longer at the center, no longer in control, facing the quiet weight of a moment that had already decided its outcome long before he ever spoke. The flashing lights were still there, still painting the street in red and blue, but something about them felt different now, less like a show of control and more like a backdrop to something already decided. The agents moved with quiet coordination, speaking in low voices, exchanging brief confirmations, every motion measured, every step purposeful, and in the middle of it all, Naomi Carter stood exactly where she had been from the start. Unchanged, steady, as if the entire shift in power had happened around her without ever needing her to raise her voice or change her stance. Ryan remained a few feet away, his hands no longer tense but not at ease either, caught in that unfamiliar space between action and consequence, where nothing is happening outwardly, but everything is changing inside. He glanced once more at the people around him. The same faces that had watched him with silent acceptance just minutes ago now looking at him differently, not hostile, not aggressive, but aware. And that awareness was heavier than any confrontation could have been. One of the agents approached Naomi again, speaking quietly. "The unit has been notified. Internal review will begin immediately." Naomi nodded once, acknowledging, not reacting, as if this was simply the next step in a process that had already been set in motion long before tonight. Ryan heard the words, internal review, and they landed slowly, unfolding in his mind with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. This was not just about a single moment, not just about what happened under flashing lights and watchful eyes. This was about everything that led to it, everything that had gone unquestioned, unnoticed, or dismissed until now. Naomi turned slightly, her gaze moving across the scene one last time, not scanning for threats, not searching for control, but observing, confirming, closing the loop of something that had reached its natural end. Then she looked back at Ryan, and for a brief second, there was something almost human in the silence between them. Not forgiveness, not judgment, but recognition, the kind that comes when truth finally replaces assumption. "Moments like this do not start here," she said quietly, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "They start long before anyone is watching." Ryan did not respond, not because he could not, but because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been revealed. The agents began to disperse slightly, some returning to the SUV, others continuing their quiet coordination, the scene gradually returning to a kind of order, but it was not the same order as before. It was something else, something grounded in clarity rather than control. Naomi took a step back, not away, but forward into what came next, her role in this moment complete. Her presence no longer needed to prove anything, and as she walked past Ryan, she paused just enough to say one final thing, not loud, not for anyone else to hear. "Power is not what you use when people are watching, it is what you carry when they are not." Then she continued forward without looking back, her figure moving steadily toward the waiting vehicle, leaving behind a silence that did not need to be filled. And for the first time that night, Officer Ryan Cole understood that what he had lost was never control, it was perspective, and it had been gone long before this moment ever began. The street slowly began to return to its usual rhythm, but it was not the same rhythm as before. Something invisible had shifted, something that could not be undone. The flashing lights no longer felt like authority on display but like remnants of a moment that had already passed. Naomi stepped into the SUV without hesitation, the door closing behind her with a quiet finality. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, focused. One of the agents glanced at her briefly. "Everything went as expected," he said, not with pride, not with relief, but with confirmation. Naomi gave a small nod, her eyes looking forward, not back, because there was nothing behind her that needed revisiting. Outside, Ryan remained where he was, the space around him feeling larger now, emptier, as if the presence that once defined it had moved on. His radio was silent, his surroundings unchanged, and yet everything felt different. He reached up slowly, adjusting it out of habit more than necessity, his mind replaying the moments in fragments, her stillness, her words, the radio call, the badge, each piece fitting into place now with a clarity that had not existed before. One of his fellow officers approached cautiously, stopping a few feet away. "You good?" The question was simple, but the tone carried something else, uncertainty, not about Ryan's safety, but about what had just unfolded. Ryan nodded once, automatically, the way he always had, but the gesture lacked the certainty it once held. "Yeah," he said, though the word felt incomplete the moment it left his mouth. The other officer hesitated for a second, then gave a small nod and stepped back, not pressing further, not needing to, because some things do not require explanation when they are already understood. The crowd had mostly dispersed now, the phones lowered, the whispers fading into the night, leaving behind only the faint echo of what they had witnessed. Ryan looked down at his hands for a brief moment, then back up at the street ahead, trying to ground himself in something familiar. But the familiarity was gone, replaced by something quieter, heavier, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a question that does not demand an answer but refuses to disappear. Across the street, the SUV pulled away smoothly, merging into traffic without drawing attention, carrying Naomi Carter forward to whatever came next, as if this moment had been just one step in a much larger path, and for her, it was. Inside the vehicle, she leaned back slightly, her expression unchanged, composed, not because nothing had happened, but because everything had gone exactly the way it needed to. The operation was never about confrontation, it was about observation, about allowing truth to reveal itself without force, and tonight, it had. Outside, Ryan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to notice, but not enough to forget. He turned slightly, looking down the street where the SUV had disappeared. And for the first time, he understood that this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of something he could not control, something that would not be decided in the moment, but in everything that followed. And as the last of the lights dimmed and the night settled back into place, one thought remained, quiet but unshakable: some lessons do not arrive with noise, they arrive with silence, and once you hear them, you can never go back to not knowing. Morning did not arrive all at once, it crept in slowly through the blinds of a quiet office several miles away, where the weight of last night had already begun to take form in a different language, not sirens, not flashing lights, but reports, timestamps, and recorded words that did not change no matter how many times they were replayed. Naomi Carter sat at the end of a long table, a single file open in front of her, its pages neatly aligned, its contents already familiar. Across from her, two senior officials reviewed the same material in silence. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of the building's ventilation system, and the occasional shift of paper against wood. "The footage is clear," one of them said finally, his tone measured, not emotional, not reactive, just factual. Naomi nodded once, her posture straight, composed, as it had been the entire night before, because this part of the process required the same discipline as the moment itself: no assumptions, no exaggeration, only truth. "There was no escalation from your side," the second official added, glancing up briefly, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "There was no need," she replied, her voice calm, steady, because the absence of reaction had been the point, the strategy, the quiet center of everything that unfolded. Miles away, Officer Ryan Coles sat alone in a small briefing room, the walls plain, the lighting neutral, nothing about the space designed to intimidate, and yet it carried a weight that pressed in from all sides. A tablet rested on the table in front of him, paused on a frame he recognized instantly: himself, standing under those flashing lights, saying words that now echoed differently than they had when he first spoke them. He had watched it once, then again, then a third time, each replay stripping away another layer of certainty until all that remained was what actually happened, not what he believed had happened, not what he told himself in the moment, but what was there, visible, undeniable. A voice from earlier returned in his memory, her voice, calm, precise. "Moments like this do not start here." And now, sitting in that quiet room, he began to understand what she meant. This was not about a single interaction, not about a single decision, it was about patterns, about habits so ingrained they no longer felt like choices. The door opened softly, and a supervisor stepped in, not rushed, not confrontational, just present. "We are going to go through everything step by step," he said, taking a seat across from Ryan, placing a folder on the table, the same kind Naomi had reviewed just hours earlier. Ryan nodded slowly, not in agreement, not in resistance, but in recognition, because for the first time, he was not preparing to explain himself, he was preparing to listen. Back in the office, Naomi closed the file gently, the process moving forward exactly as it should, no louder than necessary, no slower than required. She stood, gathering her things with the same quiet precision that had defined her presence from the beginning. One of the officials looked up. "You handled it the right way," he said, and she paused for just a moment before responding. "It was not about handling it," she said, her voice even, thoughtful. "It was about letting it reveal itself." And with that, she turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room that would continue its work long after she was gone. and in two different places, separated by miles but connected by one moment, two people stood at the edge of something new, one stepping forward with clarity, the other beginning to see what had always been there, waiting to be understood. The room felt quieter than it should have been, not because there was no sound, but because every sound carried weight, the soft tap of a pen against the table, the faint shift of a chair, the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Ryan Coles sat across from his supervisor, the tablet now dark, its screen no longer replaying the moment, but still holding it in memory. "Walk me through it," the supervisor said, his voice calm, not accusing, not sympathetic, just steady, and for the first time. Ryan did not rush to answer, he did not defend, did not justify, he paused, letting the question settle, because now he understood that this was not about speed, it was about accuracy. "I saw a situation," he began slowly, choosing each word with care. "And I assumed I understood it." The supervisor nodded slightly, not interrupting, allowing the silence between sentences to do its work. "And what made you sure?" he asked, and that question lingered longer than the first, because certainty had always come easily to Ryan. It had been part of the job, part of the rhythm, decisions made quickly, actions taken without hesitation, but now, sitting in that room, certainty felt different, it felt fragile. "I did not question it," Ryan admitted, his voice quieter now, not weaker, but more precise, as if he was hearing himself clearly for the first time. Miles away, Naomi Carter walked through a corridor lined with glass walls, each office inside holding its own version of quiet focus, people reviewing, analyzing, processing, the system moving forward not with noise, but with intention. She passed by without slowing, her expression composed, but her mind active, not replaying the moment for validation, but for understanding, because even when things go as expected, there is always something to learn, something to refine. She reached a door at the end of the hall and paused briefly before entering. Inside, another team was already at work, screens displaying timelines, transcripts, angles of footage that together formed a complete picture. One of the analysts looked up. "We are mapping the sequence," he said, and Naomi nodded, stepping closer, her eyes scanning the data, not searching for confirmation, but for alignment, because truth does not need to be defended when it is clearly seen. Back in the briefing room, the supervisor leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. "Assumptions are not unusual," he said, his tone still even, "but they become a problem when they replace observation." Ryan listened, really listened, not preparing a response, not waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing the words as they were meant to be understood. "What did you miss?" the supervisor asked, and this time, the answer did not come from habit, it came from reflection. Ryan exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a moment before returning. "I missed what was actually in front of me," he said, and there it was, simple, direct, undeniable, the realization that had been building since the moment the radio first crackled with a different tone. Naomi stood quietly in the operations room, watching as the sequence of events unfolded on the screens, each angle, each timestamp, reinforcing what had already been revealed in real time. One of the analysts paused the footage on a frame where everything looked still, but was not. "This was the moment," he said, and Naomi looked at it carefully, not because she needed to confirm it, but because understanding the moment meant understanding everything around it. "No," she said softly. "This was just where it became visible." And as the room continued its quiet work, and the conversation in the briefing room moved forward with the same measured pace, one truth connected both spaces: clarity does not come from what happens in a single second, it comes from recognizing everything that led to it, and once you see that, there is no going back to the way things looked before. By the time the afternoon settled in, the process had moved beyond the moment, and into something far more structured, far more deliberate. In the operations room, timelines were no longer just sequences of events, they were patterns, mapped carefully across screens, each second aligned with context, each action paired with response. Naomi Carter stood near the center of it all, her arms relaxed at her sides, her attention fixed not on any single detail but on how they connected, because that was where the truth lived, not in isolation, but in alignment. One of the analysts spoke quietly. We pulled previous interactions tied to the same unit. And with a few keystrokes, new data appeared, earlier reports, small incidents, nothing that had triggered immediate action on their own. But together they formed something else, something that had been building long before last night. Naomi's eyes moved across the screen, not surprised, not reactive, just focused, because this was never about one moment, it was about what that moment revealed. Across the city, in a room that felt smaller with every passing minute, Ryan Cole sat as another file was placed in front of him, thicker than the last. Its weight more than just paper. His supervisor did not rush, did not push, he simply opened it and turned it toward Ryan. "These are prior observations," he said, his tone unchanged, steady, consistent. Ryan looked down, scanning the pages, recognizing fragments, moments he had not thought about in months, interactions he had dismissed as routine, decisions he had made without hesitation, but now, seen together, they did not feel routine, they felt connected. "Do you see the pattern?" the supervisor asked, and Ryan did not answer right away, because this was no longer about what he wanted to say, it was about what was already there. He nodded slowly, not as a defense, not as an agreement, but as an acknowledgement. Back in the operations room, Naomi stepped closer to one of the screens, where a timeline stretched across several hours, the moment from the street now just one point among many. "This is where it became visible," the analyst said again, and Naomi gave a slight nod. "And this is where it began to matter," she replied, her voice calm. "Because visibility alone does not create change, it is what follows that defines it." Another agent approached, holding a tablet. "Internal Affairs has been notified, they are aligning with our findings." Naomi took the tablet, glancing at the summary, not lingering, because the direction was already clear. The system was doing what it was meant to do, slow, methodical, undeniable. Ryan leaned back slightly in his chair, the pages in front of him no longer separate events but parts of something larger, something he could not separate himself from. The supervisor watched him for a moment, then spoke. "This is not about a single mistake," he said. "It is about understanding how you got here." And that was the part that settled deepest, not the moment under flashing lights, not the voice on the radio, but everything that had led to it without being questioned. Naomi placed the tablet down, her role in the immediate phase complete, but the work far from over. She turned toward the door, pausing just long enough to look back at the screens one more time, not to confirm, not to reflect, but to recognize that what had been hidden in plain sight was now fully seen, and in two separate rooms. Under different lights and different pressures, the same realization continued to unfold, that truth does not arrive all at once, it builds quietly, patiently, until one moment brings it into focus, and after that, there is no way to pretend it was never there. The shift from observation to consequence did not come with noise, it arrived quietly, like everything else in this process. In a conference room several floors above the operations center, a small group had gathered, not many voices, not much movement, just a focused stillness that signaled decisions were no longer forming, they were being made. Naomi Carter stood near the far end of the table, listening as the final summaries were presented, each detail aligned, each timeline confirmed. Nothing rushed, nothing assumed, because this was the part where clarity mattered most. One of the senior officials closed a folder and looked up. "The findings are consistent," he said, his tone measured, final, and the words carried the weight of everything that had led to this moment, not just the night before, but the pattern uncovered in the hours since. Naomi gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because the outcome was never about opinion, it was about what could be seen, verified, and understood. Across the city, Ryan Cole sat in the same room, but it no longer felt like the same space. The air was heavier now, not because of tension, but because of finality. The supervisor across from him had stopped asking questions, not because there were none left, but because the answers had already been given, not in words, but in evidence, in patterns, in moments that no longer stood alone. "This moves forward from here," the supervisor said, his voice calm, controlled, and Ryan understood what that meant without needing further explanation. There was no argument to make, no angle to reshape the narrative, because the narrative had already been written by actions that could not be undone. Back in the conference room, another official spoke. Oversight will be restructured for the unit. And that sentence carried more than administrative change, it signaled a shift in how things would function. Moving forward, how assumptions would be replaced with accountability. Naomi listened without interruption, her role in this part not to direct, but to witness the process completing itself. She had seen this before, the moment when a system corrects not through force, but through clarity, where each step follows the one before it without resistance because the truth has already removed the need for it. Ryan looked down at his hands again, not out of habit this time, but with intention, as if trying to understand something that had always been there but never examined. The supervisor stood, gathering the files, not abruptly, not with urgency, just with purpose. "You will be informed of the next steps," he said, and that was it. No raised voice, no dramatic conclusion, just the quiet certainty of a process continuing forward. Naomi stepped away from the table, the conversation behind her still ongoing, but her part in it complete. As she walked toward the door, she paused for a brief moment, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to recognize that what had started as a single moment on a city street had unfolded exactly as it needed to, revealing what was already there, and ensuring it could no longer remain unseen. And in that recognition, there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only the steady understanding that justice does not arrive with noise, it arrives with clarity, and once it does, everything else simply follows. There is a moment after every decision where everything becomes quiet, not because nothing is happening, but because everything that needed to be said has already been understood. Naomi Carter stepped out of the building into the late afternoon light, the air warmer now, the city moving as it always did, people passing by without knowing what had just unfolded behind those walls, and that was the nature of it. Most turning points do not announce themselves, they pass quietly, leaving only those involved to carry the weight of what changed. She paused at the edge of the sidewalk for a brief second, not to reflect, not to linger, but to reset, because for her, this was not an ending, it was part of a larger rhythm, one case among many, one moment in a system designed to correct itself when given the chance. Across town, Ryan Cole walked out of the station with slower steps than usual, not because he was unsure where to go, but because the ground beneath him felt different, the same pavement, the same streets, but a different understanding of what they represented. The badge on his chest no longer felt like something that defined him, but something that had to be understood, earned in a way he had never fully considered before. He stopped near the parking lot, his eyes scanning the familiar surroundings, and for the first time, familiarity did not bring comfort, it brought awareness. The kind that changes how you see everything that once felt automatic. Inside the building, conversations continued, reports finalized, procedures followed, but outside, in the space where real change takes root, silence did more work than any words could. Naomi's car pulled up smoothly, the driver stepping out briefly to open the door. She nodded once in acknowledgement, and stepped inside, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the weight of the day had already been placed where it belonged, not carried forward, but left behind as part of the process. As the car pulled away, the city moved around her in steady motion, traffic lights shifting from red to green, pedestrians crossing, life continuing without pause, and yet, somewhere within that motion, something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but permanently. Ryan leaned against his car for a moment, his reflection faint in the window, and for the first time, he did not look away quickly. He held that reflection, studying it, not with judgment, not with denial, but with a quiet question that did not need immediate answers, because some answers are not found in a moment, they are built over time, shaped by what you choose to see after everything has been revealed. He straightened up slowly, taking a breath that felt different from any before it, not heavier, not lighter, but clearer, as if the air itself had changed. And maybe it had, maybe nothing around him was different, but his understanding of it was. Naomi sat in the back seat, her gaze forward, her expression unchanged. Because for her, clarity was not something new, it was something she had learned to carry long before this moment. Something that did not depend on the outcome of a single case, but on the consistency of truth across all of them. And as the distance between them grew, one thing remained the same in both their paths. That moment under flashing lights had not been about control, it had been about revelation, and once something is revealed, it does not disappear, it stays, shaping everything that comes after, quietly, steadily, without needing to be seen again. Days passed, not in a rush, not in a blur, but with the steady rhythm of consequences unfolding exactly as they should. Inside the department, changes were already taking shape, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet adjustments that define real accountability, policies reviewed, oversight strengthened, conversations happening behind closed doors where tone mattered more than volume. Naomi Carter stood once again in a controlled environment, this time not reviewing footage, not analyzing timelines, but observing the outcome of a system that had followed through. One of the senior officials approached her, holding a finalized report, its contents no longer subject to interpretation. "It is complete," he said, offering it with a simple gesture. Naomi accepted it with a slight nod, her eyes scanning the first page briefly, not for confirmation, but for closure, because this part was never about surprise, it was about completion. Across town, Ryan Coles sat in a different room than before, the space larger, more formal, but carrying the same quiet weight. The conversation in front of him was not confrontational, it did not need to be. Everything had already been established. The people across from him spoke with clarity, outlining what came next, not as punishment, not as reaction, but as consequence, structured, measured, and unavoidable. Ryan listened without interruption, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood that listening was the only thing left that mattered. Each word landing with a calm finality that left no space for negotiation, and yet, within that finality, there was something else, something that had not been there before, understanding, not imposed, not forced, but recognized. Naomi closed the report gently, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, because for her, this was never about one individual, it was about a system working as it should when given the chance. She placed the report back on the table, her role in this phase complete. One of the officials looked at her and said, "This will set a precedent." And Naomi paused for just a moment before responding. "It should not be a precedent," she said calmly. "It should be the standard." Her words were not heavy, not dramatic, but they carried a quiet truth that settled into the room. Because standards are not built from moments like this, they are revealed by them. Ryan stepped out of the building later that day, the air cooler now, the sky shifting toward evening, and for the first time since that night, he did not feel the need to rush away from what had happened. He stood there for a moment, not avoiding, not denying, but acknowledging. The weight was still there, but it was different now, not confusion, not resistance, but clarity, the kind that does not disappear when you look away. He took a slow breath, his gaze steady, not searching for answers, but accepting that some answers had already been given, and as he walked forward, not back into what he had been, but into something uncertain yet real, Naomi stepped outside as well, at a different place, a different time, but under the same sky, her steps measured, her path clear, because for her, this was never about changing direction. It was about continuing it, and in that quiet distance between two lives moving forward in different ways, one truth remained: justice does not end when the moment passes, it continues, shaping what comes next, ensuring that what was revealed is never forgotten, not through force, not through noise, but through the steady presence of truth that does not fade once it has been seen. Some stories do not end with a moment, they echo long after the scene has changed, long after the lights fade and the voices quiet, because what truly matters is not what happened, but what remains. Weeks later the city looked exactly the same streets, the same passing cars, the same rhythm of everyday life, and yet for those who had stood in that moment, nothing was quite the same anymore. Naomi Carter walked through another corridor, another case already unfolding, her pace steady, her focus sharp, because for her, justice was not an event, it was a constant, something carried forward from one moment to the next without hesitation, without distraction. She paused briefly at a window, the sunlight stretching across the skyline, and for just a second, there was stillness, not reflection, not pause, but alignment, the quiet recognition that everything had moved exactly as it needed to, not because of force, not because of power, but because truth had been allowed to stand on Its own, across town, Ryan Cole stood in a different kind of silence, not the kind that follows confusion, but the kind that follows understanding, the kind that does not demand noise, because it already knows what it holds. He had returned to the same streets, the same uniform, but not the same mindset. Each interaction now carried a weight it never had before, not heavy, not overwhelming, but present, a constant reminder that every decision is seen, even when it feels invisible in the moment. He stopped at an intersection, watching as people moved past him without hesitation, without concern, and for the first time, he understood that trust is not given by a badge, it is built, moment by moment, choice by choice. Naomi turned from the window and continued forward, her steps quiet but certain. Because for her, the lesson was never personal, it was structural, a reminder that systems only work when they are allowed to correct themselves, when truth is not ignored but followed wherever it leads. She did not look back, not because there was nothing behind her, but because everything behind her had already served its purpose. Ryan took a slow breath, the air steady, grounding, and as he stepped forward again, it was not to return to who he had been, but to move into something more aware, something more deliberate. The past was still there, unchanged, but its meaning had shifted, no longer something to overlook, but something to learn from, something to carry without repeating. And in that quiet distance between who they were and who they were becoming, the story found its true ending, not in confrontation, not in consequence, but in clarity, because in the end, it was never about who held the badge, it was about who understood what it truly meant. He thought he was the law, but that day, the law had a different face, and it did not raise its voice, it simply stood there, waited, and let the truth do the rest.